Hey kids, let's talk about the good old days growing up in Idaho. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Growing Up in Idaho. Every year since I was a little kid, June has been the month during the summer where we got to eat cake and ice cream in honor of my brother Mike. On the 23rd of June, which is tomorrow, he will be 60 years old. And it's kind of a landmark birthday because when you're kids, whoever thinks that you're going to ever reach 60 years old, certainly not us. And since I was the second kid in the family and Mike was the oldest, we grew up together. And we experienced as kids all of the same things. We had a lot of activities. In our house, if you hung around in the house for very long during the day, you would get chores. And we didn't want that. We didn't want any part of that. And so we would get out of the house as soon as Captain Kangaroo was over. And Jack LaLanne, we couldn't miss Jack LaLanne, of course. And we would go out and play. And we would spend all day outside and come in sometime. Well, we would come in for lunch, of course. And then we would be sure to be home for supper. That was kind of the rule. Supper's around 5 o'clock. And if you weren't home at 5, Mom would come calling, and there would be trouble if you didn't come running. So anyway, that was kind of the way our days went. And like I said, every June 23rd, we got cake and ice cream, and Mike would have his birthday, and it would be fun because it was summertime, and we'd usually go to the park or go into the backyard at the very least and have some kind of celebration. And for me, when Mike's birthday rolled around, I knew that it was going to be a feast and we would get cake and ice cream. And that was a big deal when you're a kid back in the 60s. And I suppose like it is for every kid. So in honor of Mike, I wanted to tell a few stories and just reminisce for a few minutes in this Growing Up in Idaho episode, since that's where we were at that time when we were little kids. We lived in Boise. My dad was going to school at Boise State College and worked as a deputy sheriff. And Mike and I were left, like I said, to run and play in the neighborhood. We had a few rules. Number one, we did, in fact, have our TV watching monitored. We couldn't just watch anything. And one of the shows that we were forbidden to watch was Dark Shadows. I don't know why. Our mother must have thought that it was scary. So we couldn't watch that on our home TV, but there was a neighbor kid that lived just across the neighborhood, straight across almost. Now you have to understand our house was in this neighborhood that had a circle street. You drive in off this highway next to a canal, and you would be in our neighborhood. And like I said, the street circled around all the houses there. And we lived on Ralph Roy Street, and the other street over that was the other half of the circle was some other street. I don't even recall what it was. But straight through the neighborhood was this kid who got to watch Dark Shadows. So he was kind of a hero, anti-hero in our little group. And he was one of Mike's friends. He wasn't one of my friends. I didn't really even know him. He was just one of the older kids. So anyway, I went over to find Mike one day and found him sitting in front of that kid's TV watching Dark Shadows. And I knew that I I had the goods on him, and I could leverage that for something I needed. And as we were watching the last of that episode, this woman dressed in a dark, long, dark dress fell down the stairs and died at the bottom. And I thought, okay, now I see why mom doesn't want us watching this, because people die falling downstairs. It had to be the reason. And I said, Mike, we got to go home. It's supper time. As we were walking home, he said, Jeff, if you tell mom that I was over here watching Dark Shadows, there's going to be trouble. And you know what that means. I knew what it meant. It meant that I would get a beating. Mike was twice my size when we were kids, even though he was only 18 or 20 months older than me. So anyway, I said, well, okay, I won't tell her today, but if you do anything bad to me in the next week or two, I'm telling her. So there was that. As kids, we had some things that we thought were pretty cool. One of them was every month or so, we had to go down to the barber, and we went to this guy named Curly. And Curly stood behind us cutting our hair, smoking a cigarette. And he had some magical powers, this guy named Curly did. He could blow smoke out his ears. So every time we were there, we had to, tell him or remind him, hey, it's time to blow smoke out your ears. So he'd take a big long drag on that cigarette and somehow plug up the ports in his head, and smoke would come flying out his ears. And it was incredible. As to little kids, we thought that was kind of the coolest thing there was. And we never forgot that. So it was kind of a treat to go down to Curly's barbershop and get our haircuts. And of course, we got those crew cuts. Those were popular in those days. And if you don't know what that is, look it up on Google. It's really short hair. And it was the style of the day. So Mike and I had a lot of friends in that neighborhood, but we had a lot of enemies too. And just down the street, at the end of the street on the top of the circle, was some of the kids I considered my enemies. And we would have rock fights with those kids fairly often. And when I was 4 or 5 years old, I could throw a rock nearly the length of the street on our side of the circle. And I was fairly accurate because I practiced a lot. And I could hit fairly closely to where I was aiming. And like I said, I could throw a long ways. And that came in handy. When you're in a war with the kids up the street, you got to be able to throw rocks really well. And you can't just throw rocks at them. You have to hit them. That's the whole idea of rock fights. And so I kind of had a reputation for being a fairly decent rock fight guy. And so one day we were out there, the Putnams were over for some reason. And so Richard Putnam was involved in this battle we were having with those kids. And I remember looking down. Now, this street we lived on was a dirt street, and it had gravel, and so there was a lot of rocks around, fairly decent sized rocks, even for that matter. I found a really nice rock that I considered a good throwing rock, and I was dodging and ducking out of the way of rocks that were flying our direction. I found this rock and thought, okay, I'm going to zero in on that guy down there who's been calling me names for a while. And so I lobbed that rock his direction. And for some unknown reason, I don't know why, that rock sailed off left and zinged right over into the back window of this guy's car, our neighbor. And I thought, oh no, this can't go well. So I ran up there, and the rock just kind of planted right in the middle of that back window and stuck there. So I brushed that rock off the window, and then every inch of glass crackled and fell into the back seat. Now, I had a dad who was a police officer, and I knew what happened to kids who were in rock fights and broke windows. And I figured I was going to jail. I'd been down to the jail. I knew what it looked like. I'd seen those prisoners sitting around in there in their little cages. And so I thought, that's where I'm headed. And I went screaming into Mom. She was in the kitchen talking to Lynn Putnam. That's Richard's mom. And I could barely tell her what happened because I was crying so hard. Figured my life was over. I was going to be down there sitting with the prisoners, the other prisoners, the bad people. And she tried to convince me that even though I was a criminal, I wasn't as bad of a criminal as the guys in jail, and I probably wouldn't go down there, but I was convinced that I would be there with them. Dad had put handcuffs on me, and away we would go. I would get a ride in this police car, though. That was maybe a good thing. Anyway, Dad got home, and I told him what happened. We went over and inspected the damage. And he said, well, Jeff, we're going to have to pay for this window because that's what happens. And I said, well, I'm not going to jail then? He said, no, you're not going to jail, but you are going to pay for this window. And I said, how am I going to do that? I don't have a job. I'm just a kid. And he said, oh, I'll pay for it, but you're going to repay that money to me. I never could quite figure out how that was going to work. And he said, you've been wanting a bike for a while. And so you're going to trade in this bike that you want for this window. And you're not going to get a bike this year. Sorry, Sonny. You're going to have to wait until next year. So then I started crying again, because even though I wasn't going to jail, something worse was going to happen. I wasn't going to get a bike. So all this time, my brother and Richard are standing back kind of chuckling and laughing because it wasn't them who broke the window. It was me. And they could make fun. And especially since I thought I was going to jail, they took that to the limit. Oh, Jeff, you're a criminal. You're going to be in jail sitting down there with those guys who steal stuff. Anyway, that's how it went. That's how it was in those days. So I didn't get a bike until the next year. And that was a hard thing for me, because the only other bike in the family was this giant blue thing with huge wheels. I could barely ride that because it was so big. And but and it was a girl's bike. My mom rode that thing. And so really I couldn't be seen around the neighborhood riding that, because it just wouldn't be cool. Anyway, that's some of the things we got involved in. So Mike went to first grade in Boise. And every day he would head off to school. And, I was young enough. I don't even remember how he got to school. I don't remember if mom drove him there or if he rode the bus. But he left every day. He was gone, which was good for me because I got to play with my friends and do things around the house without having him there, directing every move I made, like big brothers do. But I do remember one thing that happened during Mike's first grade year. He got expelled from school for one day. And I remember that, not because I thought being expelled from school was such a bad thing, but because my mom cried all day about him getting kicked out of school. And this is what happened. He was out on the playground playing with all of his friends, and something made him think of this. He walked over to a little kid, one of the other little kids in school, and said, "Hey, look up my sleeve and you'll see stars." And what Mike had done is he pulled his hand up inside of his coat sleeve. And of course, that little kid's going to look up there to see what's up there, like any kid would do. And Mike's fist came flying out of the end of his sleeve and knocked that kid nearly out cold on the playground. One of the playground duties, one of the teachers saw this happen. And that little kid laying there on the ground crying. So she went over and took Mike to the office, and he got to see the principal. And he got kicked out of school for a day because they didn't like the fact he punched that little kid for no good reason. So the school called. And I remember Mom heading down to the school to pick Mike up. And then she sat at home and cried because she figured she was a terrible mother for not teaching her son better and whatever else mothers go through during the time their kids are expelled from school in the first grade. Anyway, I thought it was an interesting day. And Mike, of course, he got in trouble. You get kicked out of school when you're in the first grade in the Hicks house, there's going to be trouble. So he was, I don't know, I don't recall his discipline. I'm sure he got the belt when Dad got home. Dad wore this police belt around, a big, thick, heavy leather belt. And when that belt came off, you knew there was going to be trouble. And I'm sure Mike got the police belt, probably. So anyway, that was one of the memories from his first grade year that I still remember. And he also came home from school one day, and there was a big fancy spider bike with the banana seats and a little sissy bar there sitting in front of our house. And because he didn't break any windows, he got a bike. And it was a nice bike. I was happy for Mike. And he got that bike to ride around. So later on, we moved up to Salmon after Dad graduated from college and left his police profession. We moved up to Salmon so he could be a teacher. And that introduced a whole new world for us. Going from the city to the country, we had a lot of freedom in Salmon as little kids. In fact, we were ordered out of the house to go play. So we weren't under Mom's feet bugging her. And one day we got sent out on a Saturday, ripped away from our cartoons. For those of you who remember Saturday morning cartoons, we were ripped away from those and told to go out and play and not come back until that evening. So Mom packed us a lunch and away we went. We stood there on the front porch trying to decide what we were going to do. And across the way, we could see a mine up on the side of this mountain. And so that's where we headed. We walked up there. As I recall, the Austin boys who lived just up the street, up the highway, Ricky and Danny. I think they were with us on that deal. Anyway, we walked up there and played around that mine for a while and then walked back home. I was 5, not yet 6. And so Mike would have been about 7 years old. And we had a lot of fun throwing rocks and playing on mine equipment and messing around up there. And just what kids did in Salmon, Idaho. And that was when we lived out the highway. Later, we lived there for a year or so. Then we moved into town and lived on River Street for about 3 or 4 years. And maybe longer, maybe 5 years. We were there on River Street in the family house that my grandfather, Harry Hicks, built with a plumb bob and a spirit level, from what the stories say. And it was a nice place, you know. It was an older house. Some of it was newer, and the back part was old enough that it had an old outside ice box. They weren't called refrigerators. It was an ice box, this padded box hooked to the back of the house that you would open the little door and you could see a place where the ice was put, and then all the stuff you put in there to keep it cold. That's how old the back of this house was. And one of the things that Mike and I found to be fun during our summers there in living in town was going up to the city dump. You could find a lot of neat stuff at the dump. And it would take us a half hour, maybe 45 minutes to walk up there. For those of you who remember where the old city dump is, it's up there by, above town in the foothills there on the kind of the northeast part of the valley. And you cross over the Lemhi River at that bridge and I think on that North St. Charles Street and walk up there. As I recall, that's how it was. And we'd ride our bikes or walk, whatever, and go up there and break bottles and find cool stuff. And when we had wrist rockets, we took those along so we could shoot bottles, not just throw them and break them. And then when we got guns, when we were a little older, we would take those guns with us and shoot those. I had a little 22. And my brother packed around a 30-30 saddle gun. And that's what we did. Shooting stuff and just finding cool things. And on the road up to the dump, there was a hillside there you could dig into and find fossils. It's kind of neat. So anyway, those were the things that we did. And we did a lot of camping, and we would walk down to the what we called along the river there. There's a dike, and we would walk along there in the trees and play and have a good time over by the river. Sometimes when my brother was about 11 or 12, he got a shotgun for Christmas, and so we would take that shotgun over and shoot ducks in Daly's Pond there on the way over to the river. And because we lived fairly close to the river, we were taught how to swim and how to play in the river without drowning. And because of all the experiences our dad had, he was able to identify the things we should avoid in the river, like the eddies and the sleepers, the rocks under the water that you could barely see that might pull you under and get you stuck and drowned. When we played in the river, we didn't have life jackets or anything like that. We just learned to swim well enough that we wouldn't get in trouble. And we camped, like I said, we camped over there a lot as little kids. And of course, we all had our buck knives strapped to our belts. in case the bears came along or any other, horrible thing that could harm us. Those knives, of course, would protect us. And at night, when we were in our sleeping bags, we'd put those knives in our shoes there by our head to get that weapon out quickly if we needed it. And so we lived in town. And then when I was about 12 years old, we moved out to Prow Creek there at the mouth of the canyon. And we were the first houses out there. We moved out and bought this piece of ground with Jerry and Shirley Ney, and they lived just above us there on that property. And once out there, we had the whole canyon to ourselves. And so there were some beaver ponds up Prow Creek there, a couple of miles above our house, and we'd camp up there. One time, when Richard Putnam was staying with us one summer, we were up there camping, and we had all of our gear set up right there on the north side of those beaver ponds, just at the base of this rock slide. And I don't remember why, but we decided to move our camp across the creek and sleep under the trees over there on the other side of the canyon. It was just a short walk across the creek and over there. And luckily, we decided to do that and get our gear away from the rock slide, because that night there was an earthquake in Yellowstone Park, and it sent a giant rock cascading down this rock slide, and it landed right exactly. And I'm saying exactly right where our camp was. And so if, you can imagine how horrible it would have been that night when we were sleeping to have a giant rock the size of a car land on us. So, fate or whatever you want to call it, blessings, maybe luck, kept us from getting killed that night. And that was the same camp where Dad hauled us up and dumped us off and told us he was going to be at work when we came home, so we would have to walk home with all of our camping gear. And like I said, Richard Putnam was with us that summer. And so on our way home, what we did is we divided all the gear up amongst us. And Mike had his backpack, so he shoved stuff in his pack until he couldn't get any more in there. And that was what he claimed he would take. Well, Richard and I were left with the Dutch ovens and some of the heavy other cooking things, and sleeping bags and other stuff, that boys pack along on their camping trips. And we figured the best way to accomplish getting this stuff home was for Richard and me, since we didn't have our backpacks, was to cut 2 small trees and make a little cot, or whatever you want to call it. And we stacked all of our stuff on there. We took those 2 trees we cut down and laid a blanket across them and folded it just right so we could stack everything on that blanket and carry it out of there. Now, the trees we cut down were probably at least as heavy as all of the stuff we were carrying, but it didn't occur to us that was the case. We just picked it up and carried it 2 miles. And so as we were walking along, we were hating my brother, Mike, because he just had his backpack and seemed to be jaunting along with no problems at all. And Richard and I were carrying this cot with all of our stuff, and the cot itself probably weighed 100 pounds. So anyway, we were hating my brother because he was walking out in front of us, smiling and dancing along, skipping along like he didn't have any problems at all while we were laboring under the weight of that cot. But we forgot our hatred towards Mike because about halfway home, we saw this giant rattlesnake in the middle of the road. So we had to kill that snake. So our efforts were combined against that rattler, and we forgot about how much we disliked each other. So we got that rattlesnake taken care of, and then we picked our stuff up and started hating each other again. Richard and I giving Mike looks. And I thought, okay, when we get home, I'm going to figure out a way to get even with him. And I always did. Mike bullied me around a lot when we were little kids, but I got even with him. Somehow I would get even. And, you know, like a lot of the younger brothers, I would see those ads in the comic books of Charles Atlas lifting weights and not allowing anybody to kick sand in his girlfriend's face. You know those ads. I think there was an ad about karate. You could learn karate in 7 days. For 25 cents, you could send off for karate lessons and get this, whatever. I never tried it, but I thought about it a lot, of sending off for that 25-cent karate class. Because I figured if I knew karate, I could beat the living daylights out of my brother. And he wouldn't have any chance against my karate skills. But anyway, I wouldn't usually get even with him physically, at least when we were little. I would figure out other ways. And so, you know, that's how it was between us. We didn't actually fist fight until I was in, 12 or 13 years old. And we had our last big fist fight when I was 14. So he'd have been 15 or 16. And then after that fight, after we beat on each other for a little while, that was the last time we ever did that. And we didn't have any more fist fights after that. We were good friends. It was almost like that was the last hoorah. And we stopped. And perhaps it's because I stopped competing against Mike. Everything he did, I had to try to do better, and vice versa. At that age, after that last big fight, it seemed like we just decided to do our own thing. I didn't have to try to do the same thing he was doing anymore. And so we got along really well. One of the things that we found up near our house there on Prow Creek was a snake pit. You could head up the hill into the foothills there about, quarter of a mile from our house. And there was an area on the side of this hill where there was just snakes everywhere. And I don't know how we discovered that, but I think we were up there shooting guns and playing around one day and just started finding snakes everywhere. And these are rattlesnakes. If you get bit, you're going to be sick for a while. And so we'd go up there when we were bored and just shoot snakes or bomb them with rocks or shoot them with our blowgun or whatever it was we were doing. And so that was something that Mike and I found to pass the time when we didn't have anything better to do. And the last story I want to finish up with, Mike went to college in 1980. He graduated from high school early, got all of his credits, enough credits to graduate, and he left about halfway through his senior year. He worked in cobalt for a little while, working for a geology company. And then he headed off to BYU. And he came home for Christmas that year, 1980, and brought one of his friends with him to celebrate Christmas, Carrie Bailey, as I recall. And in those days, I was driving a 67 Chevelle Super Sport. It would go really fast enough for me anyway. And we lived 6 miles out of town there on Prow Creek. And you turn there at the Chute Bridge to get on the highway. And there's a telephone pole. So if you're turning off the highway to cross the bridge, that telephone pole would be down in the bar pit on the right-hand side. And it was kind of a contest for some of us who lived up there to drive down in that bar pit as close as you could to that telephone pole without crashing into it. And in those days, you could see the tire tracks of all of us who were doing that. And of course, I got in on the action because it was just something to do. And so you turn off the highway to cross the bridge, and you go down in that bar pit, and you go as fast as you can. That was part of the deal. And the G-forces would put you down in your seat really heavy. And like I said, you see how close to that telephone pole you could get without hitting it, of course. And it was just kind of fun. So we were headed home. I had Mike and Carrie in the back seat. We'd been at a dance at the church in Salmon. And we were headed home. And now you got to remember, when you have a muscle car, you can't just cruise along at regular speeds. You have to fly down the highway. And for those of you who drove those cars, you'll remember you get to a certain speed where your car is just kind of floating. And that was kind of a neat feeling of just going so fast that you just glide along. It's like your tires are just kind of touching down every little ways. And, but of course you could still steer okay with, you wouldn't be crashing and fearing for your life. You had control of the car. So we headed down the highway going fast. And then I turned that corner to head to the bridge and went down in that bar pit. And Carrie Bailey, I didn't see him because I was driving, but he was white knuckling it. I could hear him back there, not breathing, because he was so scared. And my brother, I think, was maybe a little more used to the driving, but to cover for his friend, he had to say something about it. He's like, "Jeff, what in the world are you trying to kill us?" And because it was a habit, I didn't even think about it, driving down in the bar pit, trying to come close to the telephone pole. So I chuckled, but I got a lot of chastising from Carrie after that. He's like, "I've never driven with a more crazy person in my life. I could have been killed and never see my family again, coming up here for Christmas and dying because of a crazy high school driver." Anyway, it kind of hurt my feelings to have him talking about my driving skills that way. But those are just some memories that I had of growing up in Salmon and with my older brother, Mike. And, I look back on those days and I have no regrets. We had a good childhood, and I loved growing up in Salmon. I loved the friends I had. And I loved the family activities and being with my brother. So happy birthday, Mike. 60th birthday. You're officially an old man now, I guess. And, but I'll be thinking of you on your birthday while I'm working, and you're probably off playing somewhere. But happy birthday. I love you. Thanks for listening. Growing up in Idaho, the good old days.